Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so we can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Now let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
And a special thank you to our patrons who make this podcast possible. This episode 152, hard to believe we're that far in.
Jimmy, it is hard to believe. I was thinking the other day about us when we first started, sitting on your couch with your little laptop.
Yep, bad equipment, bad audio, bad intro, bad outro.
And hoping that each week would record and not knowing and having to re-record it. We've come away from
we have
152 episodes. So yes, thank you, patrons, very, very much.
So we want to talk about people who should be well-trained, but in reality are not, and different organizations, so forth. And so we're just going to kind of walk through. We have 5 different categories, and these are the people who have interactions with our children the most and have the most responsibility with our kids, and therefore should have the most well-trained people. And some of these organizations have no training, or grossly inadequate training, or no training at all.
Right.
So these are in no particular order, but how about doctors and nurses? I can think of, probably a dozen friends of mine who are nurses who said they've gotten absolutely zero training on how to recognize abuse or what to do if common sense kicks in. And some examples, we know somebody who told us a story of a man coming in with his spouse. She was clearly distressed, and he wouldn't leave the room. Very controlling.
Very, yes.
And she didn't have a clue what to do.
No, what do you do? And that's what she was talking to me, and she said, I did not know what to do, but I read in that woman's eyes, just as her husband hovered over her. She wasn't even speaking. He spoke for her. And that's clearly abuse. And the fear was there, right? And there was no training, not knowing what to do. And you leave these people, this woman, and you are, wrought with, you're distraught about it because something should have been done. But what is that something?
Well, and I was talking to, just the other day, I was on a podcast with Mary Byler and Audrey Kaufman, and they were talking about in the plain communities, when they go to doctor's offices, the men speak on behalf of the women. The women and children are not allowed to talk unless given explicit permission.
Heard that. Yes.
And I would say probably the vast majority of doctors and nurses don't even pick up on that. They don't know that. Right. They don't know that that's they have to be given permission by the man who's with them to speak.
You know what's weird? In this day and age, it's weird to think that still goes on here in the United States of America. Yeah. But it does. And I've heard of such cases also. And we live in an area where we see this community. And it's very true.
Well, that's what I was telling them. I said, my church office is literally across the street from our hospital. It's a small town, small hospital, but I mean, every single day I see Amish patients being dropped off.
Right.
I see the man. He's the one. And by the way, the man has to walk in front of the woman. She's not allowed to lead, even in the way they walk. So these women, I see it, and I see how vulnerable they are. And I'm like, they go in the hospital, and these people don't have a clue.
They
They've
have
never been
no
trained.
say, right?
They don't know.
And the women have no say in treatment. Also,
that's right.
They have no health insurance, so it comes down to what the man says they can pay for. So her treatment isn't even decided by her.
Right.
Talk about rough.
Yeah.
And you're right, Jimmy. There's nothing to educate. The nurses and doctors as to how to deal with this.
Yeah, I mean, we're working on that.
Right.
So I talked to Mary and Audrey the other day, and we're going to have follow-up episodes on Mary's podcast, and we're going to talk about what we do about that, because it is a huge issue. But it's not just people from the plain communities; it's all over the place. Just
and it's
a
not
gross
just
lack of training
with medical treatment. It's also with the abuse of children.
Right.
With when these children come in, and clearly you can see there's something wrong, and you know it.
Yeah, and I had actually had a case of that several years ago. But I had taken one of my kids to their pediatrician, and it wasn't the office that we normally go to, and they have a couple different offices, but we went in there, and I saw these two girls who were sisters, and they were with their dad, and you could see they were in clear distress.
You can tell, right?
And when the dad he had turned and I think was talking to somebody, and I saw one of the girls started crying, and they were whispering to each other. Well, then when their dad turned around, they perked up and like elbowed each other.
They knew better.
There were clear signs that they were under control. They were under distress. So I pulled aside one of the workers, one of the desk workers, and I told her, I was like, these two girls here, I was like, there's something going on. And I said, their dad is, I've been watching him too. And I mean, he was watching them like a hawk.
Definitely a sign. Yeah.
So I told them, and they just kind of shrugged it off, like,
what can we do?
What do we do about it?
What can we do? Right.
I mean, that's just a lack of training. It wasn't a lack of empathy. It was a lack of training. So the next category, how about social workers? These are the frontline workers who investigate reports of abuse. And yet they're way underpaid, way understaffed, and way undertrained. And they often leave children in extremely vulnerable positions. And a lot of you listeners are resonating right now because you've had experiences where you've seen children and youth, or these CPS, Child Protective Services. You've seen them come in, and you've reported abuse, and they come in, they have their little checklist, and they go down through, and of course the abuser is going to be on their best behavior. The house is going to be clean.
It's interesting.
They're going to be polite.
Because I just had a case that I was told about it. The father in this case talked to me, and he thought it was kind of a joke. He was reported for 4 different times. And I know of the family, and I know a lot of what goes on within that home. Children and youth went out again, and they went unannounced this time. And he said, I kind of laughed. He said, oh, you mean you're not going to give me a day to get prepared here, because normally they would. And he went on to say what they were looking for and all. And he said they didn't find anything again, and just kind of laughing. And I'm sure if I can see signs that they saw signs, but not knowing what to do. He works. He has full custody of the children. They come from a very broken home, but there is definite abuse in that home. But there you go. Understaffed, overworked people, social
and
workers,
undertrained.
And undertrained.
Well, I mean, this just came to my mind right now, but we mentioned last week J.C. Dugard's book. And J.C. Dugard, who was held a prisoner for years and was being raped every single day, was forced to live in a tent in a backyard with really horrific living conditions. She talked about how many times children and youth, Child Protective Services, parole officers, they would do checkups on her abuser while she's locked in cages in the backyard.
It set shivers up me. It really did. Also, the book A Child Called It. Do you remember when that?
Yeah.
When I read that, and I had to read it in intervals where I gave myself time to digest a lot of that. Same type of thing. That mother just talked over the social workers that came, even though the nurses and teachers, they knew what was going on. They knew a lot was going on. And there again, had no idea how to report. And when they did report, the social workers just didn't see it because of lack of training.
It's just a lack of training.
Yeah,
They
lack
don't,
of training.
and it's not faulting them because these people are. I think they're doing the best that they know how to do.
Right, but
you have to really get inside of the head of these abusers and know how they think, because on the surface they're going to be polite. They look like angels, right?
But they weren't reading the signs in the children.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Next category, how about teachers and teachers' aides? You have teachers who for 180 days out of the year have our children for more hours in a day than us parents have them.
Right.
Exactly. That's a reality. And look at the vast number of teachers who themselves are abusers. And yet teachers and teachers' aides are, in a lot of states, they're not trained at all. Zero training.
You know what that says to me is that, say you and I were teachers. One is I'm abusing children. That means that you haven't been taught what to look for or how to notice abuse in adult behavior, let alone to notice, to pick up on the abuse in the child. And that is critical, because you have two different components going on there of abuse, and not enough people trained to pick up on it at all, or to know what to do when they do see abuse. Yeah, and it's I think it's just sad. I've done training. Thankfully, our school district, our local school district, has called me in for several years. I think I did a training for the last 3 years, but that's for the teachers' aides. And what's interesting is the teachers' aides were very, very receptive, very cooperative. They were really into the material. You know, I did a full day training each of the 3 times. Right.
They put requests in. They put verbal requests and written requests to the superintendent to have me train all of the teachers for the school district. And every time it just falls flat. Like they get no response back. And I think, you know, this is what we're up against. And they literally have a national, I mean, not to sound inflated, because that's not what this is about, but, you know, a national expert in their backyard whose kids attend their school district, and I'm still not being asked to train the teachers.
Which blows my mind yet.
But that's just, I mean, that's where this mentality is, because I think in Pennsylvania, it's because we have that lousy 3-hour course. I hope I don't offend people here, but I'm not really here to sugarcoat things. I've been through the training multiple times that the required training in Pennsylvania for mandated reporters, and it's awful. It is absolutely ridiculous.
It's fluff. It's not the real deal. You're right, Jimmy.
So, I mean, like this training, I walked away from it being more confused. It reminds me of right now, I mean, this is a whole nother topic that has nothing to do with abuse, but it's current right now, and I think a lot of people will resonate, no matter where you fall on the mask issue. Look at the CDC right now. They're a bunch of bumbling idiots, and they look like it. They don't have a clue what they're doing. Yeah. And the announcements that are coming out are so ambiguous, and people don't even know now what the recommendations are in any given situation, because there's so much confusion.
I love this. All in Pennsylvania, everything's lifted as of May 31st, except you have to wear your mask when you're out in public. And I'm thinking outside.
I know. It's
so,
because nobody knows. The information is so
it's very
lousy.
It's awful.
And this the CDC, they're making themselves look like fools. And that's not just coming from me. I've had doctors and nurses say, we are so frustrated with what's going on at the CDC.
Do. Yeah, but there's no uniformity at all.
Not at all. And there should be, especially in the middle of a pandemic. The information should be clear. It should be current. There shouldn't be people saying, there shouldn't be doctors and nurses saying, we don't have a clue.
Right. We don't know what to advise people to do.
So, I think the same is true with teachers and with the mandated reporting in Pennsylvania. I walked away from it feeling like this was like a message from the CDC. It was muddied. It was confusing.
It is. Yeah. What do you do?
I'm a mandated reporter. I live and breathe everything, all things abuse. And I walked away from that feeling, in some senses, dumber than when I started the training. So we've got to do better.
Yeah, we have got to do better. There are no clear defined lines for us as far as reporting. And when we do, there again, we have untrained people to deal with the reporting.
Right.
Or we have way too many reports and not enough people to deal with it. So.
Well, and you have too many people whose hands are in the pie, so to speak, of leadership, because you have school boards, you have the union, you have the school attorneys, you have Harrisburg that has the mandated reporter training,
it's really
and all their guidelines and all the laws, and then you have the practical aspect of it is what actually works to keep kids safe.
Right. And what do you do with these children in these homes where there is abuse going on? What do you do with the children?
Right. So. Yeah. The next category 4, attorneys, district attorneys, and judges. And I'll give you a prime example of this. I mean, this is embarrassing. Our justice system, the more I hear people who are going through the justice system, Audrey Kaufman is another one. Last week was a big week for her. And, she posted stuff on her social media. And Peter Smith at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, he wrote a phenomenal piece on that sentencing, or not sentencing. It was a court, whatever they're called, the court. Court date. No, it's the court date where he pleads whether he's guilty or innocent.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Anyway, he had her ex-husband had secretly decided to plead no contest. Well, she wasn't notified about that, and it caught her and the judge off guard, and the judge was furious about this.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? Like there's this total lack of communication, lack of understanding, lack of dynamics from abusers. And Josh Duggar is another prime example. The federal judge who, like 3 days prior to handing down this order to Josh Duggar, wasn't even a judge. She was an attorney for a trucking company. And so I'm going to read an excerpt from this. This blows my mind. Keep in mind, Josh Duggar had horrific child images and videos that somebody from HSI, Homeland Security Investigative Unit, said they were in the top 5 worst of the worst cases that he's ever seen. Videos and pictures depicting abuse in over 1,000 cases that he's been a part of. So that gives you a little glimpse of what little Joshy Duggar was up to. So here's a paragraph that I'm reading from this article. Judge Christy Comstock said the former 19 Kids and Counting star must be under home confinement with a GPS monitor and may only leave for, now listen to this, may only leave for work, education, religious activities, or for medical issues. She also forbade him from any contact with minor children apart from his own 6 children, whom he can see if his wife is also present. So he's still allowed to go to work.
I don't see where the confinement is, by the way.
Right. There is no confinement.
No, I don't see it.
There's literally no confinement.
Right. I don't see it. None.
He can go to work. Anything that he calls education, he's allowed to go. That's such a loose, broad stroke.
You got it.
religious activities, he's allowed to show up to church. And believe me, I know how the religious community works. He will be welcomed with open arms. If you think for a second that they're going to say, Josh,
get out of here.
You get out, you stay away.
No.
Look, what we did,
Right.
I did that to my own father because he was talking about showing up to church before he got arrested. I said, you show up on the doorsteps of this church, or I'm going to physically remove you myself. I told him that. Josh Duggar, I guarantee, received this warm welcome into the church. If you think they're going to monitor him and keep kids from coming up and hugging him, and I
it's shake
business
my
as
head,
usual.
Jimmy. I really do. I really do at so much of this. I don't know what it will take to get people to understand abuse is serious. It harms children, not just for a day, not just a little bit, but often it's a lifetime.
Right.
And the seriousness of it is degrading, it's manipulative, it's sinful, and it is a crime.
Yeah, a serious crime.
It is a serious crime. And it's treated like, I don't know, that sentencing or whatever it was, mandate there, it's like sprinkling water on a fire, just sprinkling a little few drops of water.
Yeah. I mean, we could go on down the line. Brock Turner, look at the judge in that case, gave him what amounted to not even a slap on the wrist.
Right.
That was an embarrassment to our justice
Kind
system.
of gets me ill, really does.
It's just the lack of education. And again, that's not just me observing or us, trying to observe and form an opinion. I've had multiple attorneys, district attorneys, haven't had any judges that I know of, but I've had a lot of attorneys and DAs come to me and say, have you ever considered doing training for people like us? They've gone to trainings of mine that I've done other places, and they've said, we really have zero training.
And
that's
here
coming
again,
straight from their
even
mouths.
with training, we need laws to be changed to back up the training.
Right.
So, it's a whole composite of things.
Yeah. And then the last category, I mean, this one I think is blatantly obvious, but churches and other youth-serving organizations, Christian camps, not even Christian camps, just any kind of camp, Boy Scouts. Look at that whole debacle that's still going on. That's never ending.
No.
Churches and youth-serving organizations have so much access to our kids, and they ought to be the top trained out of everybody because of the volume of kids that are inside of these organizations.
And because of the lack of oversight when these kids are in these organizations, because they're deemed child-worthy. They're deemed, that's a good place.
They're kid-friendly is the word. Yeah,
when
they're kid-friendly.
Right. When a bus comes along in a I'll say a poverty area or whatever you want to call, and picks up kids to bring them to church, you expect those children to be protected and taken care of. Sadly, they're not. That's not always what happens. You know that. I know that.
Right.
But, the view is, well, what a good thing, to get your little kids in church, get them there. They'll be taken care of.
And there's that little tickling of the ego where you look at these organizations, you look at these churches that are just, overflowing with kids. And what's the first response from people?
Oh, it's wonderful.
Wow, how wonderful.
Yeah, it is.
Look
it's
how
wonderful.
many kids they're, look how many kids that they're bringing in, and they're affecting their lives.
Well,
and
we gauge a church often by how many youth they have.
And their kids' programs.
Right.
Look at how good this kids' program is. Well, that's great. If they have a good program, we celebrate that. But are those kids actually safe? Are they training people to keep those kids safe?
Keep them safe, exactly.
Because if not, who cares about your kids' program?
Well, way back when we started our podcast, we mentioned time and time again how churches are often a playground for pedophiles.
Yeah.
No, in fact.
And that's not changed.
No.
That's not changed whatsoever.
No.
And it needs to. Churches are among the least trained and have the worst track record for abusing children and covering up abuse. And so, my question is, why in the world is there no required training for all seminary students just as a beginning? That's just the beginning.
Right.
That's not an end meets all. That's just for beginners. Why is there not a required course for every single seminary student that ever graces the doorstep of a seminary?
Right.
Why is that not a mandatory training?
Yeah.
And I'm not talking a 3-hour training. I'm talking a full course, a 3-hour course at a bare minimum that ought to be required.
There are not qualified people to teach, number one. There's not qualified curriculum, number two. Number three, I really don't think there's enough interest
There's
yet.
not. And I know for certain that my alma mater has been contacted multiple times by multiple people saying, look, Jimmy, one of your graduates, along with a couple others, Christine Parker's another one. Here are these people who are more than willing to put a course together, or to point you to a course. There's already curriculum that's out there, and there's been crickets.
I really feel
crickets.
that within the churches there is a lack of interest. I really do. I think they're so focused on teaching the word that they don't see this as part of God's word.
I just don't. I don't understand why.
Because
you can
it's messy.
intentionally.
This gets messy.
Yeah, you can intentionally.
It gets messy.
Ignore and refuse to.
It gets messy.
Address it.
That's why it's easier to teach Jesus and God, God is love, than it is to teach this.
Yeah, it's insanity.
This. Yeah.
But, we don't want to leave you completely depressed. I think some of these are pretty obvious, and some of them maybe you didn't have an awareness that, for some of these, there are no trainings whatsoever, no required trainings. So maybe that's something that's news to you. Excuse me. Maybe for some of you, this is just common knowledge, but we don't want to leave it there. What we want to do is set the stage for going back and having episodes for each of these categories and saying, what would we do? If we had a say, which maybe we do, maybe we don't. But if we had it our way,
right? What would
we envision
exactly
for each of these categories? What kind of a training for doctors and nurses? What kind of a training for social workers? What kind of a training for teachers and teachers' aides, attorneys, DAs, judges, churches, and other youth-serving organizations? What would that look like? So we want to be proactive and talk about solutions and not just the problem, because I think sometimes in advocacy, all we ever hear are the problems.
Well, we need to talk about solutions, right? Otherwise, we're left hanging with this big problem, and it is depressing. We do not want to do that here. Also, you mentioned just lightly in our talking that possibly we can pull in from time to time a nurse or a teacher or a counselor or a CYS person to talk to them and say, in a perfect world, what would a training for you look like?
And, I would mention too, within each of these categories, there are little pockets. In all 5 of these categories, there are little pockets of exceptionally well-trained doctors and nurses, social workers, teachers, teachers' aides, attorneys, DAs, judges. There are pockets of exceptionally well-trained people. And so I think what we need to do is talk to people who've been well-trained. I know Victor Veith is one who his organization, does exceptional training, and he's training a lot of people in a bunch of these different categories. So, he might be one too that would be a great guest to say, okay, you're doing a great job even nationally training people, but how do we bring that to our community?
Exactly.
How do we bring your training to our community?
Exactly.
There is good training out there. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. That's the great news about this.
Exactly.
It's not like we have to start from ground zero and say, okay, now we've got to develop a training, and where do we start? There's great training out there.
Is top notch. Yes,
it exists.
Yeah. But the question is, why are we not using it, and how do we get it in our local communities?
Right.
Okay.
So we will leave you with that truth bomb for today. There's hope. There is a dire need, clearly, for there to be more universal training, and we're going to talk about solutions. We're gonna talk to people who can help make that happen, and that's going to take you guys too. It's going to take an entire community to make that happen.
Yes.
But there is hope. We thank you for tuning into this episode, and we'll catch you next round.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron, and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.